Good evening. I'm Dan Sutter, the Charles Koch Professor of Economics at the Johnson Center here at the Troy University and host of EconVersations. Tonight on EconVersations, my guest is going to be Dr. G.P. Manish, who is a new assistant professor here with the Johnson Center. And his area of expertise is central planning. Tonight he's going to be talking to us about a case of central planning in India. So welcome, GP.
Thanks, Dan. Great to be with you.
It's hard for us to remember now, but prior to the fall of the Soviet Union, central planning was viewed, and socialism was viewed very differently. We have a slide here to show from Time magazine, a Time magazine cover from the 1950s, to show Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev's famous line that "We will bury you," a remark he made to some Western reporters in the 1950s. But that really largely signified what a lot of people, not just in the Soviet Union, but in the United States, amongst professors, thought about socialism. That was known as scientific socialism. So.
Yes, I mean, you're right, Dan. Most economics professors, most economists, especially starting towards the late 19th century, but also through the first half of the 20th century, actually believe that socialism is a better economic system than the market-based economy. They believe that full-blown central planning would lead to greater prosperity and would also lead to higher standards of living than any market-based system, any capitalist alternative. So in that sense, what Khrushchev was saying was kind of signifying the prevailing ideology. People actually believed, and he, I guess, did as well, that the system which Soviet Union was following would actually beat out or outcompete, all the market-based economies.
Mm-hmm. And here with our next slide, this is actually, amongst economists, this is a very famous slide, maybe a little hard to see, but this slide was actually from a famous economics textbook by Nobel Prize-winning economist Paul Samuelson, one of the great economists of the 20th century. And what you can see there in blue here is his projection of Soviet GNP and how it was going to overtake the United States.
Yes.
And again, this just further reflects this view amongst economists.
Right. I mean, this is, again, a good, it captures well the prevailing viewpoint. People did believe this, and as you said, Samuelson was a prominent, probably the most prominent economist post World War II, if not in the world, definitely in the Western world. He was very well known. And he, in a sense, the fact that he could draw a graph like this in his book signified the prevailing beliefs amongst the economics profession at large that the Soviet Union was, not just the Soviet Union, but other socialist leaning or other economies that had embraced central planning were onto a kind of a new progressive wave. And that was the sign of the future. And that, in a sense, America, along with all the other more market-based economies, were kind of reactionary or were remnants of the past. And so even those, especially in the early part of the 20th century, even those economists who did call not for full-blown socialism, but did call for some interventions into the market economy, did so largely because of their political feasibleness, in the sense that they actually wanted the end goal was socialism, but they just felt that the best way to get there would be to introduce a few interventions one step at a time. And this is in fact something which Ludwig von Mises in many of his essays points out. He says it's not like we have people who believe in some government intervention and then we have socialists. Most people, and he's writing in the 1930s and 1940s, and he says that most people who believe in even some government intervention are all believe in full-blown socialism. Mm-hmm. So basically you have a few defenders of the market economy and you have everybody else. And that included people like prominent economists like Paul Samuelson.
So it wasn't just a handful of Marxist
ideologues. Marxists did believe in certain, there were many differences between different kinds of socialists. Marxists believed, they had some differences theoretically from other proponents of socialism. They might have believed in certain different, a slightly different socialist state, you could say, than others might have believed in. But you're right, it wasn't just restricted to a few dogmatic Marxists. It was, in fact, considered the wave of the future.
Now, you mentioned Ludwig von Mises. Many of us at the Johnson Center consider ourselves Austrian economists. And,
right.
and Mises and his student Friedrich Hayek were engaged in the 1930s and 40s in a very important, at the time, debate amongst economists about whether
right.
Socialism was truly feasible or not. And this is, for Austrian economists, a very important issue.
Yes, it's an important issue because it kind of cuts to the heart of why markets are more efficient and they're a better system. And so this debate was being conducted on the one hand largely by Mises and Hayek against many different professors, all of whom were debating, who were arguing the opposite. So the debate really, and it's called the economic calculation debate, was one about whether or not socialism would be more efficient as an economic system than capitalism or a free market economy. And what what the point being debated really was whether or not resources could be allocated, amongst various uses in a rational, efficient manner under socialism and under a market-based economy.
Now, although much of that debate was centered around the U.S. and the Soviet Union, as this graph indicates, it was actually a very general argument that Mises and Hayek were making. They were arguing against socialism, the feasibility or the effectiveness of socialism in any nation, whether the Soviet Union or England or France or in the United States, wherever it might be tried.
Right. Their argument was, both sides of the argument were engaging in universal arguments. They weren't talking about any one country, any specific geographical area, or any specific historical period, but they were making, universal arguments which were true for all time and place. And what Mises and Hayek were arguing was that, well, absent a price system, right? Because one of the features of a central planning system or centrally planned economy is that you don't have prices simply because you don't have any real exchange of commodities, because there's one entity, that is the state or the government, which is allocating all resources.
Right.
And in that kind of system, you don't necessarily need people to engage in any form of trade or exchange. And so you don't have any prices. And what Mises and Hayek were arguing was that, well, if you don't have these prices, there is no way that entrepreneurs can calculate profits and losses, and they'll never know, which way, there's no way to calculate profits and losses. And so there's no way to know whether resources have been allocated in a rational manner or not, simply because it's profits and losses which tell us whether or not a resource has been allocated in the right way or a wrong way.
So then, given the general nature of this argument, although much of the attention did focus on the Soviet Union or China, and then with the collapse of the Soviet Union in the early 1990s, and China's move toward the market beginning in 1978, many people viewed this as the end of the debate. But actually, Soviet Union and China weren't the only nations to experiment with central planning. In India, which is a subject of your research, was an important case as well.
Right, that's absolutely true. In fact, not just India or China, but lots of developing countries who gained independence soon after World War II or in that era. Lots of ex-colonial countries gained independence, and given that the prevailing view or the prevailing ideology was that it's socialism which will lead to fast economic growth and progress, lots of those countries did adopt a system of central planning. Of course, the Indian system differed from the Soviet and the Chinese system in the sense that India did not have a real revolution. So we did not have a full nationalization of all industry explicitly. So it wasn't that the state explicitly owned everything, as was the case in the Soviet Union and China, where basically they kicked out most capitalists. The state kind of owned or nationalized all industry. That wasn't the case in India. In the case of India, the planning was more subtle. It was done through regulating an existing private sector.
So in many ways, then I think the case of India maybe is a better example of how central planning or socialism might possibly ever be enacted in the West, because it didn't follow a violent communist revolution. It came from within, in a country that remained democratic the entire time, and whose leaders were, compared to the Soviet Union under Stalin, very civilized people. So why don't you tell us a little bit about when India became independent and adopted their mechanisms of planning?
Yeah, I mean, and talking about humane or very well-read leaders, the slide here is of Jawaharlal Nehru, who was the first Indian Prime Minister, and essentially the politician who was the architect of planning in India. And he was educated in Cambridge. He was a very well-read, very well-traveled man. Not at all somebody who wanted to shut people in a gulag, or throw them, to the wolves. A very, a man with good intentions, definitely, and a socialist, nevertheless. And so, what happened in India was essentially that. And just
to give a little bit of perspective here, when is this happening?
Right, in 1947 is when India became independent. So to give you a quick, kind of a brief history. Officially, India was a was a colony of the British Crown from 1857 to 1947, and in 1947, gained independence from the British. And what happened? You could divide that period into some broad phases. So the first approximately 55 years, about 1860 to the First World War, 1914. Was a period where India was governed largely by, on Victorian principles, like on the same principles as England was, so free trade, largely with the rest of the world, etc. And of course, soon after World War I, and especially in the 1920s and 30s, changes in the intellectual environment in the West started affecting India. So India, just like in Europe, like Germany and other countries, India also had a nascent socialist movement. Nehru himself was a prominent leader of that, the socialist wing in Indian politics, and they slowly gained power and influence. But of course, when upon the time of getting independence, they found that a full-blown kind of revolution on the Soviet lines was politically infeasible, because India had quite, a considerable bourgeois or a capitalist class. We had big businessmen who had businesses. They weren't, it wouldn't be politically feasible to just, completely send them all to the gulag, or to completely take over their property. And so, what the Indian leaders finally did was they kind of had a blend. So they had a big public sector, certain areas of the economy, what were called the commanding heights of the economy, like iron and steel and mining, etc., were kind of reserved for the public sector. But nevertheless, they didn't kick all the private guys out. Instead, what they did was they enacted lots of different regulations. And with the result that ultimately they controlled what was being produced, even in the private sector.
So there were, your research talks about several periods of this underplanning in India. And so we have a graph here that shows what the average growth rates were by year in those different periods. So why don't you tell us about these three periods of.
Right, so you have the first three periods here, that is 1950 to 65, 66 to 80, and 81 to 90, are all under planning. And India kind of started leaving the planned economy. They started engaging in more market-based reforms starting in 1991. So that last decade there, it would be more under reforms. And the growth rate, as you can see, these are per capita growth rates. For the first period is about 2%, 2.1%. The second period, 66 to 80, it goes down below 1%. And in that last period, 81 to 90, it actually shoots back up to 3.5%, where it stays even in the last period, 1991 to 2000.
And since 2000, actually,
the
economy's
further
actually improved.
Yes. Between 2000 and 2010, I think the per capita growth rate would be closer to in the 5 to 6% range.
So this first period of planning, is actually considered by many folks in the conventional wisdom to have been a successful period.
Right.
Correct?
That's largely because the growth rates were much higher than what they were prior to independence. Well, as I mentioned, the Indian economy did see many changes under the British, especially in the period after 1860. We did have more or less free trade with most other countries in the world. The British introduced the railways. The railways were built in India at that time, which greatly changed, the extent of markets.
Right.
So many different people started producing for the market for the first time, instead of just, engaging in self-sufficient economic activity. So they started trading, they started engaging in trade. You had new industries come up within India. So for example, you had India had a huge cotton yarn as well as a cotton cloth industry,
Okay.
A huge tea industry, as well as jute, which is a cloth like industrial hemp, as well, of course, as the big agricultural sector. And even within the agricultural sector, you saw improved crops being grown. Better cereals like rice and wheat started entering everybody's consumption basket.
Right.
As compared to more what are called inferior cereals, which were grown before. So all this was happening, as the British were there.
Right.
So there were major changes taking place, but nevertheless, the growth rate was quite low. And of course, even as of 1947, the Indian economy, showed all the signs of an underdeveloped economy. That is, it had a huge agricultural sector, which had most of the national income or GDP was generated in the agricultural sector. Most people were employed in the agricultural sector. We had some industry or manufacturing, but even that, most of it was consumer goods being manufactured. Right. India imported a lot of machines and capital goods, right. And all iron and all these other different commodities we needed. And so in a sense, what the planners, including Nehru, what they really wanted or what they envisioned was that they wanted to rapidly industrialize India. And that's why they adopted a policy of planning. And what they wanted essentially was increasing economic self-sufficiency. So not only should India produce agricultural products and consumer goods, but slowly they should also start producing, all the machines, all the iron and steel and copper and tin and everything in-house within India. And so it was a kind of a system that didn't encourage foreign trade, and at the same time it required intense central planning, but all with the view to rapidly industrialize the country. So in that first phase, that's what you see, an increase in the growth rate soon after these policies were implemented.
Now, although the first period is considered a success, you can see that the second period
is a failure.
Did not do as well,
right.
and that's fairly widely regarded as a failure.
Right, and then the third period again is regarded as a success in the traditional, or there is still a debate, but there are lots of economists who say, well, if you could have such high growth in the last 10 years of planning, why did you start reforms at all? Because, maybe planning would have worked eventually.
Now, of course, there have been a few economists who have criticized or taken issue with this conventional view, especially that the first period was one of success and that the third period where planning seemed to be working well enough that it didn't need to be abandoned. And so tell us a little bit about some of the critics and where your research fits in.
Yes, well, the pictures here, a gentleman in the middle there is B.R. Shenoy. He was probably one of the first and fiercest critics of planning, and he was criticizing again in the 40s and 50s when the great economist P.T. Bauer once said of Shenoy that he's the only voice against planning, to the west of West Germany, basically. To the east of West Germany, basically. Beyond, there's nobody else with him. But he was a fierce critic in the 50s. His daughter on the right there, Sudha Shenoy, she was a fierce critic of planning as well. And on the left there, you have Dr. Jagdish Bhagwati. He's probably the most famous of all three. He's an economist right now in the United States. And he's been a vocal and fierce critic of planning starting maybe in the 70s and 80s. And they have, I mean, all of them make different points, but broadly speaking, what my work tries to do is to try to build off some of the work that they have done, and is to, take on especially these two periods, as we saw in the earlier slide, the first and the third period, and try to show that, well, even though maybe the GDP growth rates did happen to be high, nevertheless, most of the goods produced were goods which were not consumer goods, which were like capital goods and other goods which were not machines, tools, etc. And secondly, that and there was not much growth in consumer goods production, throughout that whole period, especially of mass consumer goods, like food and clothing and things of that nature. And the other point I try to make is that whatever was produced was of extremely poor quality, technologically backward as compared to what the rest of the world was producing. So in many ways, the goals which the planners wanted to get at, they weren't achieved through planning. And so I argue that reforms are much better, and that there has been improved. I mean, now you have products in India which you get all over the world. Right. The quality of products is much better, and it's also benefiting poorer people, as Dr. Bhagwati has pointed out in a recent book of his.
Now, when we get to that third period, the final decade or so of planning, when the growth rates really jumped up and, and the economy started to grow in a healthy fashion, which has been continued since then with reforms. Why is it that you argue that the planning regime wasn't really responsible for that upswing in growth?
Well, because they could be. I mean, you could be held responsible in the sense there was planning, and they did allocate resources, and all those things continued. But what I try to argue is that I try to disaggregate what was produced in that period as well, and I try to show that, well, there wasn't much growth for those commodities which entered the basket of the average Indian. Most of the consumer goods which were produced remained something which was only restricted to a very narrow or minor part of the population. And also some of the goods produced were of extremely poor quality. So for example, telephones, you had to wait for 4 years to get a new telephone line, for example. The televisions were still black and white, and the quality of these televisions was poor. So my research goes into trying to show that hidden behind these aggregate growth figures, that the actual state was very different. And in a sense, my research is similar to the economist Warren Nutter, who did similar research for the Soviet Union, because there was a period when the Soviet Union was also showing very high growth rates. And he does the same thing. He disaggregates, goes in below those growth rates, and shows, well, the real picture is quite sad, and there's not much improvement in standards of living. And that's what I'm also trying to show.
Now, throughout this period, India also had one of the most highly educated countries in the world, especially in terms of advanced numbers of people holding advanced degrees. And that is sort of related to some of the areas where the Indian economy has emerged, leading growth in the recent decade. But those weren't really areas that were being highly planned, were they?
No, you could argue that some of that was a result of a desire to educate more people, but the fact that you could take advantage of that education and those skills is a product of reforms. So it's not so all that you see today, for example, the call centers and all the IT boom in India. Lots of them did get educated in many state institutions, but of course the opportunities to make use of those skills would be absent if there were no reforms. If India, if they couldn't trade with the rest of the world, and if all the controls which existed in under planning still existed, there would be no room for private enterprise the way it is, and therefore they couldn't take advantage of whatever skills they have. I mean, in that sense, you could say that. I mean, for example, if let's say the Soviet Union decides to build a huge steel mill, and at that time it's completely economically useless. But then once you have reforms and once you open the economy up to the rest of the world, then the steel mill is utilized well. You could think of the education in India as something like that,
Mm-hmm.
because under planning there was the phenomenon which is called the brain drain,
Right.
when most of the smart and educated people in India left. And now, in fact, recently there's signs that that trend might be reversing, that the people are willing to go back now, because the standards of living are, there's more opportunity for starting a business, etc.
Now, what was sort of the impetus for the reform in India? Did it come from the economics profession to some extent? Did it come from the external critics like Bhagwati, because he was an Indian economist but in the United States?
Yes. One of the things which Indians could do, which, for example, so the people in the Soviet Union or even China, to the best of my knowledge, couldn't take advantage of, was being able to travel.
Mm-hmm.
So we had lots of Indians, for example, like Dr. Bhagwati, who came abroad to study,
Mm-hmm.
take advantage of the facilities here, and of course, as ideas in the West changed, their ideas changed as well. And to a large extent, by the 80s, or late 70s, early 80s, there was a change in the mood even in the West here.
Right.
And that kind of, in fact, was infectious, and lots of Indians who were economists and then who were powerful or had some say in the policy making, and continue to have say in policy making, learned their economics here, and so were affected by that.
Mm-hmm.
By that, change in the mood here. So you could say, to some extent, it was led by such economists and bureaucrats who were educated abroad. And once it's began, there's been so much improvement and there's been so much more vibrancy in the economy that those reforms have never been abolished.
Mm-hmm.
So the call is only to expand on the reforms, not to go back.
And slowly over time have standards of living for average consumers gone up as well?
Yes, I mean, the quality of goods has gone up tremendously, and so has the standard of living. I mean, there's evidence now that even the poorest, some of the poorest people in India are benefiting from this growth. Though the debate is still open on that, there is still a debate raging amongst economists, especially Dr. Bhagwati and Amartya Sen, who believes more in redistribution, etc. So there is some debate there between the two of them, arguing how much reforms have actually benefited the poor. Dr. Bhagwati thinks and tries to provide evidence to show that there's a lot of improvement in the in the poorer sections of society, but Dr. Sen thinks otherwise. But I mean, the sniff test, in the sense of just going and living in India, as someone who's lived from the 80s through now, there's a huge difference, and I mean, people are, I think, much better off.
Well, thank you very much. I think this has been an interesting conversation. And as we mentioned, and I think India probably provides a much better example of what planning might look like in Britain or the United States, should it ever be adopted, than the old Soviet Union or the communist China back in the day. Right. So it's very, I think, often overlooked topic. And well, thank you for your for tuning in tonight. We will be back next week with another episode of EconVersations, and our guest next week will be actually GP's dissertation advisor, Dr. Ben Powell from Texas Tech University. And so please join us then. Thank you very much.